Hi guys, it's Dr. Kim from It's Like This podcast, and there's no jingle or intro music with this one because we'll be talking about suicide. I think every time a high profile person or celebrity commits suicide, it just sends out a nuclear wave of confusion, awareness, and we all start to wonder, maybe things are not as they seemed on the outside, and we start to kind of speculate. But underneath this confusion about suicide and who commits suicide and how do they commit suicide, why do they commit suicide, a lot of them are not explored, and maybe it's difficult to explore because a lot of us are really good at hiding our problems. And in this episode, my colleague Gillian Rodriguez, she's expert in suicide. She's a therapist, and we're gonna be speculating and discussing what we experienced as a human being and also as a clinician about suicide, our experience and our knowledge about suicide. And we're going to speculate together how we can understand somebody who's going through suicidal ideations and how we can help. So we'll have some tips at the end for those who are going through the valleys and the family members and friends whose loved ones are going through the valley. So I hope that you listen to the end and find comfort and hope in this episode. Hey guys, welcome to It's Like This podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kim. And today we have a guest. She's my colleague and networking therapist that I met, in my private practice journey. And she really stood out to me because she encountered suicide and death in a multiple different way. And I think of her as an expert in this matter. And her name is Gillian Rodriguez, and she is here with me. So Gillian, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And I'm really excited about this topic because suicide is so misunderstood. And I think sometimes even as a provider, it's mysterious. Sometimes it's very unexpected. We cannot calculate it. We cannot really study it to bring comfort to me as a provider and also comfort to my patients. So I'm curious and I'm very excited to explore, with you. So Jillian, tell me a little bit about yourself. How did you encounter, death/suicide in your life? How did it kind of evolve? And also, what are you doing nowadays?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you for having me. So I am a fourth generation funeral director and embalmer, and I have a career in mortuary science before I even became a licensed professional counselor. And so I think that was my first experience with suicide or with traumatic grief of any kind was really in the capacity of assisting people through the funeral planning process. And, through that journey and through that time, I realized I wanted to know the story beyond the week or so that funeral directors get with people. And so I became a licensed professional counselor. I completed my licensure right at the launch of COVID, which was a super special experience in its own regard. But while I was in graduate school, working as a funeral director at night, going to school during part of the day,
Wow.
I was actually on call as a funeral director when I received the notification that one of my closest friends had died by suicide. She had
Wow.
taken her own life. And I was the funeral director that was, again, on call and dispatched to respond to her death and charged with making those arrangements. And so I think it really took what was professional and made it into something personal
Mm,
in those moments.
mm,
You know, when I first got the call, that adrenaline starts, and I sort of went into that professional mode of,
Mm-hmm.
okay,
Mm-hmm.
we're just going to handle this. We're going to support the family and do what I always do. Um, and there was some feeling too of, I know about suicide. I've seen this happen before. This is not an unfamiliar, sadly, territory for me to be in.
Mm.
But I mistook that familiarity with um, knowing everything about it.
Ah, wow.
And was very quickly humbled and shown that I actually didn't know what it was like to be on that side of it, that personal side at all.
Mm.
Um, so once her services were completed, I took, at the time, it was, again, this was graduate school in the summer. You can't take a great deal of time off without losing the whole semester's worth of work. So thankfully, I had professors and professional colleagues at the time I was with UT Health who supported me and said, look, take whatever you need. So since then, I have, kind of fast forward to today. I became a licensed professional counselor and decided, because of those combined experiences, that I really wanted to specialize in suicide ventions and suicide vention work, which really covers a spectrum of prevention, intervention, and postvention, or
Mm.
suicide specific bereavement or grief.
Wow. That story is so rich. There's just a lot of things that we can kind of talk about, just your short intro. First, I want to kind of clarify because I don't have a background in mortuary science. Can you describe to me like what that is?
Sure. So mortuary science refers to the study and professional practice, essentially, of death care. So that's everything from making funeral arrangements with someone after an individual has died to um, all the way through to what's called the final disposition of those remains. And that can be cremation, that can be burial, that can be anatomical donation for medicine or science.
Mm.
There's so many options these days.
And I just want to kind of take your life's journey with death and suicide, like step by step. It's like very interesting because you said you're fourth generation mortuary, director. So there's that childhood, and you mentioned professional familiarity. And I think it's interesting for you because professional familiarity started from your childhood, because this was a family business. So what was your, if you can recollect, idea of death and suicide when you were younger?
Yeah. So I think when I share this journey with people, sometimes they think of the movie My Girl with,
Um,
like kind of growing up in this
oh
funeral
yeah,
home that's an
that's
actual
mine.
house. And right, like that's the picture that comes to mind. And truthfully, it's not far off from that. Or
Oh.
at least it wasn't in my childhood. My grandparents, we would go to their house, and their house was on this very large hill, and the hill was separated almost in half by this fence. Okay. And on one side of the fence was my grandparents' house and the pool that we swam in the summers and things like that. And on the other side of the fence was the cemetery for the entire
Mm.
county. And so, I have memories as a child of running with my cousins, and we would sneak into the cemetery at night because it would be spooky and sort of exciting. And, we would sneak over there to go play, you know, hide and seek almost. And it really was great teaching moments for us, because the way that my grandparents spoke to us about that, the way that my parents would speak to me about that wasn't punitive. They weren't punishing us for playing as children do. It was more teaching about how to have reverence and respect for people who have passed on, and
Mm,
how, their resting place is not the place to direct that, childhood energy, and playtime. And my family has always spoken openly and very directly about death. We,
mm,
even just in the verbiage, we use the word died or die,
yeah.
or, kind of rarely we'll say passed on. But
Mm-hmm.
in, in my friends' families, I would say, did someone die? And people would look at me like,
Yeah.
oh, that's such a
Yeah.
stark word to use. And it never occurred to me to not use that word.
Right.
Um, so
And
I
we
think,
were taught in like child psychiatry terms too, when we discuss, death of loved ones with our kids, we recommend using the word died and avoid the terms like pass away or gone to the other side, because these vagueness and euphemistic with good intentions actually creates more confusion for the child. How did your family growing up talk about suicide?
so that was, like most people, that was a little bit different.
Yes.
The first time that I heard about suicide, I actually had seen, I think it was essentially like a police case report,
Mm,
or investigative report, something along those lines. I had seen that on a desk, and I, as any children are, I was very curious about, well, what is this word? What does that mean? I had never seen that word before. And I always would look at like manner of death, cause of death, because I
mm,
wanted to know, how does this happen? All of the different ways that this happens.
mm,
And the first time that I saw suicide, I had never seen that word. And so I just asked and said, what is this? And I was told it's when someone takes their own life.
mm-hmm,
And even as a youngster, I was confused, because I was like,
mm,
what do you mean takes their own life? What do they take it
mm,
and do what with it? They go where with it? Like, I
yeah,
didn't compute what that meant.
sure.
Um, and so, they had to tell me very directly, it means that they kill themselves. And I think at that point, I had just never thought of that. It had never occurred to me that that was an option in
Mm-hmm,
life.
mm-hmm,
um, and I couldn't really wrap my mind around how why would someone do that?
right.
And I think those are questions that, for adults, even for myself, even persist to this day. Right? It's
Mm-hmm,
one of the ultimate questions about
mm-hmm,
suicide.
mm-hmm. How do we as a humanity reach this point of death? And there's so many different ways to get to death, right? And you were curious about that. Was that out of place of fear or wonder or curiosity? Like, what did the that curiosity mean for you?
I think it started with curiosity and wonder. As a child, I didn't have a great deal of fear,
Mm-hmm.
uh, until it was learned to me to be afraid of something.
Mm,
And so I think it started with curiosity and wonder. And then when I learned about things like suicide, when I learned about things like homicide, that
mm,
people could kill each other, in fact, and that
mm,
that could happen. I think then, there was some fear element added into it,
mm,
because it begins to occur to you that these things could happen to people that you love or to
mm.
yourself. You think of mortality in a very different way when it's something that could be done to you instead of something that happens to you.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so, nowadays I would say it's a little bit of all of the above. I don't think any human is above or absolved from the idea of fear.
Mm-hmm.
uh, as familiar as I am with this space, there are still moments of being affected by things in a challenging way.
So, I want to kind of just revisit the professional familiarity because you experienced in childhood, by your family business, and now you're kind of running the mortuary as a director. And what was that kind of familiarity, like professional familiarity, like?
Uh, so,
Was it
you
different?
know, was it yes. It was very different. I think when you're working in that professional capacity, you have to wear a lot of different hats, just like in
Mm,
a private practice, right? You have
mm-hmm.
to think about, of course, the people in front of you, but you also think about timesheets and staff and billing
Yep.
and paying the electric bill and are the
Mm-hmm.
cars washed. And I mean, in the family, we have this sort of joke that funeral directors are just like wedding planners, but a little bit different because,
Yeah.
we deal with music and flowers, and there's the day of the service, and there's the order of events and how things will go. But there were always, I think, to kind of, this kind of brings me back to suicide topic. There were always those moments where you just pause and you have stillness,
Mm.
with the family that you're serving, or even with the individual who has died. And you just have those still moments of reflection and kind of still asking those questions, um, in terms of, how did you get here? What was your story? What was your journey? How how did the path bring you to me?
Mm.
And it's a very spiritual thing. It's a spiritual space to be in with people, whether they're living or dead. And it's something that I'm so honored to be able to do, because it's a very specific moment that you get to be in with someone.
Why do you think suicide made you think get in that spiritual realm in the midst of all these administrative chaos that you have to do, right? I've been to a few funerals and it's very fast paced, and everything
Yes.
has to happen very timely, So what do you think made suicide cases more spiritual?
Um, for me, it just always felt so much more personal and
Mm,
personalized. And it's not to say that other kinds of death are impersonal.
right, right. Yeah.
There was just such a sense of when someone had died by suicide, the family was affected in a very different way. And I think it led me to a spiritual place because even just being in the presence of the person who had died, preparing them for whatever their service was going to be,
Mm,
um, there's almost a spiritual feeling of wanting to understand, but also wanting to restore and offer that restoration in some capacity because there wasn't that restoration in life for them.
mm,
Um, Even if it was something as simple as, making sure someone's nails were done perfectly or making sure that a letter was placed with them prior to cremation.
mm,
Spiritually, being in a place where you're able to facilitate some level of restoration or connection, I think is just, there's nothing like it. That I have not found that same spirituality in many hallways of many other churches that I have been to. And so just having that connectivity is a unique thing.
I'm kind of reflecting as yours kind of reflecting, and suicide is unique type of death because there was an internal struggle within that person that led to a decision. Like I like what you said before because like what is done to you versus or done to you or done by you,
Mm-hmm.
versus what happens. And it's like we know that evil events happen, and it's a lot of times happens to us or to our loved ones, but suicide, and I would include maybe homicide, you know, personal homicide events, where there's that spiritual struggle prior to death. Of course, spiritual, emotional, mental, but also cognitive struggle. Like you're thinking it through and you're running into scenarios like, what if it was this and that? And I could, and as you and my professional life, we talk about these cognitive struggles that crosses the line between life and death and worth, all that. And I think that's so spiritual. What do you
It
think?
it it is, and I think in a lot of ways it's really the definition of spirituality. It's the
Mm,
seat of spirituality, is that space between, right? That's indefinable, indiscernible, but we certainly know it's there. It's different than a feeling, it's different than a thought. It's its own
wow.
thing. And
Yeah.
and I think that's the seat of spirituality, is that space in between. And it's interesting because there's research that has essentially conducted surveys or interviews with individuals who have made a life-threatening suicide attempt. Life-threatening meaning this was a suicide attempt that was very much intended to have been completed, and
Mm,
it was only through medical intervention, or frankly chance,
yeah,
luck,
chance. Yeah.
fate, that didn't happen. But they've talked to these people to try to get a better understanding of what got you there, what got you to that point, what do you remember.
Mm,
And a sizable portion of these individuals have said, I don't regret that I attempted, but I don't want to attempt again,
mm,
which is an interesting kind of dialectic to hold, right?
mm.
But also the thing that resonated most with me is that there's a sense of overwhelming need to escape. And it wasn't even so much that they wanted permanent death or to be gone. They simply did not have another door open to them
Yeah.
of possibility for how to handle whatever was happening in their life.
Yes.
And I think that's something that people can really relate to, whether you've experienced suicidal ideation or not. You
Mm-hmm.
know, most of us have been in those moments where we just are like, man, if there was a mouse hole in the wall right now, I would crawl through it, right?
Yes.
Like,
Yes.
just intense desire to not be in a situation that we're in.
Mm,
And it was when I understood that study that I really, had a greater sense of, this is, more often than not, this is not something that's done to inflict pain on others. This is not something that's done to achieve a certain outcome, if you will, for lack of a better phrase. It's truly that sense of overwhelm.
mm.
And I think when it's looked at through that lens, instead of very specific mortality, you killed yourself lens, it's
Yeah.
very different in appearance.
Yeah. And I think um the most common misconception about suicide, I think you mentioned, is that it's a selfish act.
Yes. I hear that all the time. I have for a long time now. That it's selfish, that it's cowardly, it's the
Mm,
easy way out.
mm-hmm.
Um, and and it's something that I think individuals come to that determination about it, or that outlook about it. Um, Personally, I think it's a defense mechanism,
Mm,
because it alleviates us having to confront the real issues underneath, right? It's
yeah.
much easier to say, oh, well, that's just them being selfish, than it is to say, what was going on there, what was their part, what was my part, maybe what was
Mm-hmm.
something else. It's much harder to confront the roots of it than it
Yeah.
is to say, it's selfish or it's cowardly. And I think the other side of that too is that suicide as an act is more often than not seen to be done for selfish reasons,
Mm.
in the sense of, if someone feels that overwhelmed and that intense of a need to escape the situation that they are in, that doesn't necessarily imply that they're not overwhelmed because of wanting to save or spare other people from something. So, you have scenarios where suicide happens as a result of, I think those are significant myths about
Right.
suicide.
Or even that sense of responsibility and guilt that they are affecting their loved ones. Like I think that could be even just overwhelming.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
Mm-hmm.
I think this is also where we see the connective tissue between suicide and elevated risk populations, individuals who are journeying through addiction or
Mm.
chemical dependency in some way,
Mm-hmm.
um, individuals who are engaged in criminal activity or illegal activity in some way.
Mm-hmm.
If it's between me taking my own life or sparing my family a lifetime of journey through addiction with me as an
Right.
addict, for some people, that's not as difficult of a calculus to make. And it's
Right.
not a selfish act at all in that
Or
way.
even perceived, like I hear a lot, like when they're depressed, right? It's like, I'm such a burden to everyone else, so I
Mhm.
want to alleviate them from the burden. So suicide is the only answer. And interestingly, I think when we were talking like on the other Zoom call before, I had a mentor in psychiatry. She's very high functioning, professional, and she committed suicide because she couldn't face some of the mistakes or mishaps. And I think high performing persons are also at high risk of suicide. So it's like, even if you're not making these series of addiction choices or substance abuse or criminal activities, you could have this perception of what's expected of you versus not meeting that, being such a overwhelming disappointment that leads to suicide decisions.
Yes, and that's 100% correct.
Mm-hmm.
We see this most often in situations where that disparity is, suddenly and abruptly widened. Maybe
Mm,
someone who's a very, highly accomplished professional, highly accomplished student, straight A's, all the things going for them, right? Is what
yeah,
people say, but very suddenly fails an exam or loses a patient or encounters a lawsuit or something.
yeah,
You're talking about, with society, there's just this incredible intolerance of imperfection.
yes,
And
yes.
I think that is applied tenfold the higher functioning an individual is, ironically
Mm-hmm.
enough, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
it's almost the more you achieve or the more you accomplish,
You have to keep
the
it up.
higher you have to keep it up, and
Yeah.
and the higher that level of perfectionism is.
And also, I would say that I will say this, and I have a question for you. It's a performance pressure to look like you're okay too.
Yes, I think that's a perfect way to put it. Sometimes the performance is our career or our role in the family, our role as a provider in the family or something like that. Sometimes the performance is an outcome or a task or an
Mm-hmm.
event,
Yeah.
right?
Or don't be too depressed. It brings everybody down.
Exactly. The
Mm-hmm.
masking, right? We
Mm-hmm.
hear this a lot from patients, I think, where it's,
Mm-hmm.
they share this sense of, I have one version of me that's on the outside and I have one version of me that's on the inside. And
Yeah.
I think suicide most often happens in the space where those two versions are suddenly and abruptly just wildly disconnected in a significant way.
Yeah.
Um, or it's been, such a chronic struggle to even maintain their connection at all between their, authentic self and their public self, that that struggle just gets exhausting. It gets tiring. But it's such a nuanced thing. And I think that's what keeps me in the space of suicide professionally, is because I've worked with so many people over the years in lots of different roles, and I have yet to encounter two that are the same.
Yeah.
Um, the reasons are never the same, the journey is never the same. It's always unique, it's always so personal. And I think that's where it just is. It's something that there's so much learning yet to be done about it.
I wanted to ask you, we talked about how suicide is not a selfish act and it's a response to find an escape from overwhelming pressure or unachievable expectations of themselves, provided internally or externally. All that stuff, I think, is psychologically sound, explanation of suicide. But there's also interesting depiction of suicide in the media, in the movies, and Netflix shows that really glorify sometimes and dramatizes
Mhm.
suicide.
People who are creatives, who make this content and who design this, should have the ability to do that expressively and in a way that sometimes is very dark and can be very horrifying.
Mm,
Um, at the same time, I think the challenge that I always come back to with things like these shows, at least that I've seen so far,
hmm
is that there's not often the perspective of others that is equally glorified
mm,
or explored. There's not often the perspective of the psychiatrist who has been treating this person for years
yeah,
and knows them,
yeah,
and has to cope with that grief themselves of losing a patient.
yeah.
There's not the perspective of the death care professional who has to, prepare this person and see this day in and day out. There's not the
Mm,
perspective of, family members or others who are affected by this in a very different way. And so, on its face value, I don't have an issue with media or even entertainment sources that explore topics like suicide.
right.
I do have a wish that there was a more diversified perspective included. Um, I wish there were a greater effort at looking at those stories where there is survival, where there is spiritual discovery, where there is hope as part of it, not in a toxic positivity sense, right? Like,
Toxic
I think,
positivity, that's a good one.
I don't wish for it to be talked about and then say, oh, but everything will be fine. Just look on the bright side. Like,
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
think that's necessary, but I think it's okay to look at these
yeah.
topics in a way that says, but there is actually another doorway open to you, or there is actually an out, or
Hmm.
um,
So let's kind of move to, you know, maybe prevention and intervention portion of suicide. We, I think like I'm really resonating with what you said, where there's a gap between maybe who you see yourself, right
mhm,
now versus who you should be. And when that gap widens, it brings an emotional response that's overwhelming. And
mhm,
sometimes, in that state of maybe fight or flight, that sense of being overwhelmed, suicide
mhm,
seems to be the only escape. And I would say that Sometimes that decision-making window is very narrow, it's very sudden, you know,
Yes.
or it could be very drawn out and years
Hmm.
of trying to explore this other alternative escape that doesn't work out, like substance doesn't work out, this
Hmm.
relationship doesn't work out, academics doesn't work out, and it kind of leads that, to the dead end of suicide, so it could be very drawn out
Hmm.
journey, leading to
Hmm.
suicide. What do you have for that person who could be or is in that journey of contemplating suicide as an only option? And also for the family members who might be witnessing or avoiding to explore that journey of their loved ones? I think that's a two
Hmm.
question I have.
Yeah. Um, so I'll start with the with family members or friends who may, know someone who is struggling with this journey. I think the first thing I would say is that it's literally all of us. Every single one of us knows someone who is struggling with this, whether we're aware of it or not.
Mm,
And so I think the first thing would be just having a conscious awareness that you know someone, whether you realize it or not.
mm,
Um, and the reason why that's important for prevention is because something as small as, wording can be literally life saving.
mm,
When we're having our own conversations and, you know, using wording that is rigid and extreme and just unforgiving in a
mm,
sense, right? That very deterministic defined sense. You're really letting others know around you that there are no exceptions in your thinking,
mm-hmm,
and that can create dark and lonely spaces for other people where they say, okay, it's not going to be you that I talk to, let's
mm-hmm,
let's go over here.
mm-hmm,
So here's an example of what I mean by this, right?
mm-hmm.
The word should,
Oh yeah.
right? Should implies that there is an expectation, at least in your mind, of something, right? I should be a certain way, the expectation is that I'm a certain way. Changing that out for would like to be or could be, even something that minor of a shift can let that person know, hey, my opinion is still that I would like you to be this, but that's very different and a little bit more psychologically flexible
Yeah. There's like
than
wiggle room
you
for
should be.
another view. Yeah.
Yeah, if there's some imperfection there, it's going to be okay because there's that margin of allowance for that. So that's the first thing I would say, is that we all have a person that is around us that's affected by this. The simplest thing that you can do is look at the words you use, look at how you talk to everyone, because
Mm,
you don't know necessarily who it is,
mm-hmm.
right? Um, and just follow through. So, what I mean by that is people often hear, hey, if you need anything, I'm here. Let me know if you need
Mm,
something. But are you? Are you really?
mm.
Like, are if you say that, be prepared
Count the
and
cost of what you're
be,
promising.
yeah, be receptive to the fact that that could actually happen. If you say, if you need anything, I'll be here, and you get that call at 2 o'clock in the morning when you're tired and you're grumpy already from a long day, like, are you ready? Are you ready to
Yeah.
take that call? Do you have the phone on? Because if the
Mm,
answer is no, then let's like maybe look at what we're saying and offering to people if we can't follow through on that. If you are offering unconditionality to your friendship, to your relationship, whatever that is, make sure that that's what it is that you're prepared to follow through on and that you're
yeah.
broadcasting. You can't
Yeah.
say, I have unconditional love for you and I'm there for anything, and then turn around and say, but I hate all people that are like this.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
those things just don't go together.
Yeah.
So psychological flexibility can go a long way, follow through can go a long
Mm.
way. In terms of what I would discuss for people that are journeying through this, that may be having suicidal ideation, um, it's something where there's no singular answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there are options when you may not see options. There is hope even when you may not see hope. And I think putting more concrete definitions to those things can be helpful people who are having these thoughts too. So hope doesn't have to necessarily be this magnanimous cloud, angels and clouds and
Yeah.
lofty concept, right?
Yes.
It doesn't have to be the painted sign on your wall at home next to live, laugh, love. Like,
Yeah.
like the real
Yeah.
deal, like meat and potatoes of what hope is the belief that something has the possibility to be different. It doesn't have to be 100% better. It doesn't have to be completely resolved. But if you have the smallest belief that whatever is happening can be a little bit different, that's hope. That's what it is. And
Mm,
sometimes it's that smallest of kernels that is the difference between someone who attempts suicide and someone who does not.
mm.
So putting concrete concepts and definitions to these things that people with suicidal thoughts are often told, right?
Yeah.
I would also tell them there are so many other people just like you in so many circles. Please come and find us. And I say us very openly and candidly. I've had suicidal ideation myself
Mm-hmm.
historically. I've
Yeah.
experienced that um, that feeling of just being compressed and you don't really see what other things are up. It's a tunnel vision. And
Mm,
come and find us, come and talk to us, whether we're the therapists or friends or someone else, but come and find us because you're not the only one who has experienced this or felt this way. And everyone else who has ever felt that way has not died because of it. There
mm,
is the possibility to feel this way and to experience these thoughts and still live in a very, joyful and purposeful way. There is the ability to have struggle and have darkness, but also acknowledge light and feel success. So come and find us, come and talk to us. We can share with you. I don't
mm,
have a secret sauce, right? Like
mm-hmm.
I,
Mm-hmm.
I can't offer that, but I can sit alongside you and I can tell you that I know what it's like to feel that way.
And I would say I had suicidal moments myself. I think a lot of people do because facts are life is hard. People around you and in the world doesn't make it better. Like cancel culture and these ex- extraordinary high standards of morals and ethics and performance and
Yes.
looks and all that stuff, right? Like, and that just kind of brings me back to it's not a solution, but I think kind of vibing with what you're saying is I want people in that moment to know that you're you're most likely and probably and definitely doing a lot better than you think.
Yes. Yes. Being able to have that other perspective of ourselves. I always tell my patients, you don't have to believe what I'm telling you. It doesn't have to like pull at your heartstrings yet, but I do want you to actively listen to it and at
Mm,
least acknowledge it in a way that it could be possible, right?
yes.
Completely agree with you and completely agree with the idea that as professionals, if we've experienced our own journeys with things, it informs our ability to care for others in a very in a much more dimensional way,
Yes.
in my opinion. And
Yeah.
I think the other thing I would say about that, and that I would say to anyone who's had these thoughts or experiencing these thoughts, is that in my many years of doing this now, either as a funeral director or as a counselor, I've talked to probably thousands of people who have lost someone to suicide. And I can tell you, as I mentioned, they're all different stories, all different reasons, all different circumstances. I have not heard a single person, and I say this with conviction because of the truth of the statement. I have not heard a single person tell me, even in the most private moments of therapy, you know what? I'm glad they did it. I'm glad they're gone. I
Mm,
have not heard that yet. There may be lots of feelings there. Some of them are not positive, some of them are not happy and joyful, roses and daisies. But I
mm,
have not had someone tell me that, you know what, they were such a burden and now I don't have that in my life. Those reasons that sometimes people with ideations express, I don't want to be a burden, I'm trying to spare them from this, I'm trying to help them. I
mm,
have yet to hear the other side of that that matches. And maybe it's possible that as powerful as those cognitions can be, it doesn't mean that they're accurate, right? We don't
mm,
have to believe everything that we think. Come and find us, find providers that are affirmative of what you're experiencing, that, you know, are able to talk to you and with you in a different way instead of at you. And
mm.
you know, you're not defined by these things.
Well, Jillian, it was such a wonderful spiritual conversation. We're tackling such a heavy topic, and I know that the listeners all benefit from it because not a lot of people talk about suicide, and especially from your expertise over your course of life. And I just want to say thank you. And for anyone who's listening who is struggling with these dark thoughts, there's 988 suicide hotline. They made it really easy. Just call 988 and then you'll be plugged into a trained professional who can guide you kind of through this journey, because to tell you that this is not the only escape option that you have.
So, as you mentioned with 988, they are trained professionals. I promise you, I've met these individuals who work these hotlines. They want to be there. They really want to be there. It's not the kind of work you do to have a job, it's a
Mm,
calling that they have. And so they very much want to talk to you. It is free to call. It is available 24/7, 365. You don't need insurance. And you can even do it through text now. So if you
mm,
text the word talk to 741-741, you know, it's 2022, almost 2023. Sometimes it's hard verbally for us to get the words out, right? But you can text it as well.
mm.
Um,
And it was really good conversation. I feel very grounded and aware and appreciative of the work that you do. And thank you so much for your time. And thank you, listeners, for staying with us. It was a heavy topic, but I think it was well explored. So please come back for the next episode.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate your time and your openness and willingness to share too.